Hi, I'm Dan, and welcome to the third episode of RSTalks, the Rocscience podcast. In episode 2, we talked to John and Evelyn, two founding members of Rocscience, who mentioned the impact Dr. Evert Hoek had on shaping the company. We thought it was only right in this episode to honor the legacy of Dr. Evert Hoek, a true legend in rock engineering and a cherished mentor to Rocscience. As a founding father of the field, his work, like in the Hoek-Brown failure criterion, shaped our understanding of rock mechanics and influenced our software and content. Check out Hook's Corner on our website to learn more about his published work and his legacy. In this episode, we'll be talking about the impact Dr. Evert Hoek had on Rocscience by talking to two of my colleagues who had the privilege of working with him. Please welcome Brent and Reginald. So thankful to have you on the show. Yeah.
Good to be here, Daniel.
Yeah. So just for the audience, Brent is our Chief Technology Officer. He's also an avid golfer. So if you believe his knowledge of rock fall and slope angles gives him an unfair advantage, you have to play him and find out. We also have Reginald, who's our Chief Scientific Officer, which I've heard is fluent in several languages. So if you hear me switch to a little bit of Russian, don't be surprised.
That's good.
Yeah. So thanks so much for joining us. I know you guys are extremely busy.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks so much. And actually, before we begin, I just want to mention that I do this thing where I present the guests with some tea or coffee, or is the sort of the specialty that I'm works or interested in. So you mentioned that you wanted a nice strong espresso.
That's right.
To wake you up from the delay of flights.
That's right. I just got in from Florida this morning at 4 a.m., so I'm a little bit tired.
And I'm very thankful that you made it here and you're willing to keep shooting. You look great.
Yeah, thank you.
And also, I made you a matcha latte. We didn't have chai latte, but I will.
That's good.
But I will learn that in my repertoire, and when you come back, I'll do it for chai.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm sure I enjoyed this.
Of course. Yeah. Please have a taste, and then we'll get started with the podcast. And this is just a pour over. Yeah.
Perfect.
Good. Oh, it's very good.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
That's excellent.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. So the beans are from a local roaster in Toronto called Velvet Sunrise.
Okay.
Please sponsor us.
Yeah.
So let's begin. So this episode, we're trying to dedicate to the legacy of Dr. Evert Hoek. Now, I think if you're in the industry, you have heard and know about this legend. Mm-hmm. But how did it come that you guys met Dr. Evert Hoek? And maybe we'll start with Brent, when you first met him.
Oh, I met Everett I think it was 1988. Mm-hmm. And I remember vividly that John Curran, who the founder of Rocscience, called me over. I had just started my PhD at the time. Mm-hmm. And he said, I want you to meet somebody. And he ushers me into an office. And in that office was Evert Hoek. And I immediately recognized him because, he is a legend. And, his books were used in teaching at the University of Toronto. And, I was in awe, first of all, like anybody. And, John proceeded to introduce me. And Everett was such a nice guy. He immediately made me feel relaxed and comfortable. And I still remember the conversation. And it really, made me realize that I had made the right choice in going to U of T with him being there.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what about yourself, Reginald?
So I must say I first heard about Everett when I started my PhD at the University of Toronto.
Okay.
In 1994, which means I missed him by a year. He finished there in 93, right? Thereabouts, yes. So I missed Everett at the time. Then I heard a lot about Everett. I saw his experiments. And the classic one where he had a broken rock with some rock bolts and you could walk on this a slab made out of gravel, just supported by a rock bolt, just to demonstrate the principles behind rocks.
So I remember Mark Diedrichs on top of it, jumping up and down.
But that was awesome. So I had heard all about this excellent man. I think a couple of times I came across him, but as Brent said, he was such a legend that I don't think I ever spoke to him all of that time. Then I had worked at Golder years ago, and when the founder of Golder, one of the founders, Vic Milligan, died, Everett came for the funeral. And somehow I got nominated to pick him up from the airport with Dr. Paul Marinos and take them to the funeral and drop them off back at the hotel, things like that. So that was the first time. And as Brent said, I mean, I was scared, intimidated getting to meet this man, but he was the sweetest gentleman.
Yes.
And he made me completely at home. And we had very good conversations. Prior to that, we had some email exchanges and stuff like that. But this was the first close encounter with Evert. And even during those 2 trips to the funeral and back, and I think to the airport or something like that, the conversation was wonderful. He gave me some career advice. So, no, Evert was just an amazing person.
I think it's great to hear that it wasn't just professionally he was an excellent person, but as a character, talking to you guys and willing to, I guess willing to teach and willing to work with people like yourselves.
Yeah.
I think that's amazing. Did you then progress to keeping in touch with him when you guys were starting to work at Rocscience then?
Yeah. So, well, it's interesting you asked that because, my interest at the time and still today is developing software for rock engineering, soil engineering, geotechnical engineering in general. And at the time that I had met him, I had just finished writing a program on discrete element analysis and working with John Curran. We really wanted to develop software for the mining industry that would help them solve particular problems that they were interested in. And little did I know that Evert was also a programmer. And it's a very people don't realize this, that if you look at a lot of his early work, a lot of the reports that he wrote, he backed them up with GW basic programs to solve these particular problems. For instance, rockfall. The original rockfall program was written by Evert Hoek in BASIC. The original S-wedge program was written by Evert Hoek in BASIC. Sharma's analysis, Evert. Planar failure, Evert. Right? It goes on and on and on. And a lot of these programs, of course, inspired us to create better products for industry.
So he was all for the computer side of using computers.
Absolutely. That's what, sort of drew him.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're absolutely right about Evert just wanted tools for the practitioner to be able to incorporate that into his work, his or her work. So that's why, it was, the interesting thing is he embraced computing long before it became mainstream engineering as it is now. Sometimes we take it for granted. Everybody uses software tools today. But at the time Evert was programming these things, it wasn't.
Yeah, it really is amazing. I think of Evert as sort of the first programmer,
wow,
right, of what was then the rock engineering group of the University of Toronto, and later, Rocscience. So he knew programming, and he knew software, and it was always his opinion, as it was with a number of us at the university, that it was a great vehicle for technology transfer to industry, right? To go with the books that he was also writing at the time.
And to add to that, I'll say Evert was also one of our key technical support people behind the scenes, because that's one of the ways in which I got to first interact with Evert, through technical support, ask him some questions, just to be sure that the answers were given to clients, or I was given to clients, was correct. And he always gave very helpful advice.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it looks like it was like a match made in heaven with Rocscience, that we would take off and do all these tools. And he started out, and I'm assuming he just, how did he feel about when we started to grow, when we started to make these additional things?
I think he always took great pride in how Rocscience began, and then proceeded to inspire a lot of engineers. And I stayed in contact with Evert, all the way up to him passing away, and he continued to work with me on certain features and additions, and because he continued to work. He continued to work on tensile strength implementations for the Hook-Brown failure criterion. He looked at Voronoi type testing models for dog bone samples, and all these things. He would call me up and say, I got this idea, but RS2s, for instance, can't do it. Can you do something for me? And we continued to work together like that for 30 years.
Yeah. And the other thing, just to add a little bit to what Brent said, that Evert consistently did was support us, even in our conferences, like RIC or anything we did. Evert would lend us whatever support we needed, advice, things that will help us put on an excellent, end product. Evert was always involved in advising us, and he kept us grounded, practical. I mean, I kept hearing that word all the time. It has to be useful to the ordinary person.
He was an outstanding mentor, and I remember him saying to me personally, he said, Brent, you write this software and that's all good, but have you ever been underground? And I said to him, no, Everett, I've never been underground. And he said, we're going underground. And, within a couple weeks, I was underground, right? And, he was such a great mentor to all the graduate students at the university, making sure that our education was well-rounded, both from a practical sense and from, a research sense and that sort of thing. So he really was quite a man.
Do you think that trait rubbed off on, or were there particular traits? I noticed that when I talked to both of you, you always mentioned that it has to be useful, it has to be what the practitioner would do and so forth. Do you think that came from his mentorship and pushed us in the direction of making useful tools rather than really advanced tools?
A lot. Yeah. I would say, at least from my perspective, a lot. Because he kept hammering it in. You can always, when you're doing something, what would Evert say if Evert dealt with this? It would actually help you think through what you wanted to present, because it had to be practical. It had to be useful. I met him at conferences, and that always came out. And in fact, one of the days, much later in the game, I remember him asking, Reginald, do you think we need more sophisticated constitutive models? And he does appreciate the fact that we still want to explain other aspects of behavior of rock masses and stuff. It never left him. But that component of it has to be practical. He kept hammering on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No, I think that philosophy has traveled through Rocscience since its inception, is that the idea is that our software has to be practical, easy to use. A ground control or geotechnical engineer has, on site or in a consulting office has to be, easy, be able to use the software, right?
And then on top of that too, the amazing thing is how he balanced this simplicity and practical aspects with also solid theoretical or scientific backgrounds. Because Evert can ask you very hard questions in his own sweet way, but it forces you to think about the science behind what you are doing. So for me, one of the things I love about it is it's not just practical, but he also, to whatever degree he could advise us, tell us and make sure we're doing the right things in terms of implementing the right theorems, implementing the right mechanics. And that was very important. The mechanics had to be right.
Right.
So you see it in our software that it's sometimes you may think because it's so practical, it's just for practical engineering. But if you go deep in it, the mechanical underpinnings are very solid. And that's something that Evert insisted on. He would, if he tries it and he finds the results funny, Brent, you know better than that. Yeah. You talk about it. I mean, Evert will make sure you fix it.
Yes, for sure. For sure. No, what you say, Reginald, is exactly right, is that we had excellent mentors for the physics side of our software, and it was just simply required that our tools, even though they were easy to use, they had to be, soundly based on good theory, and had to be well validated and verified, and all these sort of things. I mean, we were making tools that, we wanted the whole mining industry to use, the civil engineering industry to use, billions of dollars of infrastructure using these packages. They had to be right. And he knew this. And he was doing consulting himself with this software, right? Yeah. And you certainly didn't want to pick up the phone with Evert on the other side and him at a job saying that there was something wrong with RS2. You didn't want that to ever happen.
He sounds like the perfect tester of our software. I mean, obviously, theoretically, he can mentor you and do tech support. But I feel like if you just give him the software, and he can probably break it down and tell you all the issues with it. And
absolutely, there are so many features in the software. I can't name them all. That specifically come from Evert and his ideas based on his consulting practice.
No, he always wanted to make sure that. I mean, he would use it. He was a user, as Brent said.
Yeah.
I mean, he would use the software tools and check out at least some aspects of it. And he could always break things down to simple components and check and say, I don't think this one is exactly right. And if you look at it, using his engineering judgment was super. So it allowed him to evaluate results and the common sense smell tests. He always had it.
Yeah.
Big time.
For sure.
Was there any one major feature that his testing sort of made sure that became successful that you can think of?
Oh,
I'm sure there's a whole list. But
there's numerous ones.
Yeah.
I remember when he took Mark Diedrichs, myself, and Carlos Carranza Torres down to the Yacambú keyboard tunnel in Venezuela. Yeah. And once again, this was because, Brent, have you ever seen a tunnel? And I'd say no, and we're going to go see a tunnel. And the tunnel had segmented. It was drill and blast. It had It had steel sets, and these steel sets had gaps in them, right? And because the tunnel was at quite a depth, what you would do is place these steel sets in, and then the steel sets would close until they would lock together, okay? And we had nothing to model that with, but Evert said, basically, we need something for this, right? Because, what we currently had in was phases at the time, right? And if you don't know, phases was the first name of RS2. He said, this is a fundamental criteria, mode of failure that we need to be able to model. And, that inspired us to add that particular feature to the software, and we needed it for that particular job. So that was one of the first times I've ever added something that Evert said was needed.
From my memory, it's not something so much that he asked us to add, but the moment we added it, he was one of the first serious testers, joint networks.
Oh, yeah.
The moment we added joint networks in RS2, again, Evert was one of the first people to have a good go at it. And one of the things he used heavily, he was doing some research on spalling behavior type mechanisms. So he was trying things with Voronoi. If you remember.
Well, he did
anyway.
Yeah, he did a lot of work on the AECL experiments. Yeah, I remember he was modeling that quite a bit.
But years later, as soon as joint networks came into play in RS2, he tried to analyze some of those problems with joint networks. So that was quite interesting.
Yeah. In fact, to a point where I don't think I saw a model that Evert built after he tried joint networks that didn't have joint networks. Right? He used them all the time.
like you, as you mentioned, like the strain locking, I believe was the tool here. That's like one tiny dialogue, simple idea, but it seemed like from that to joint network, which is like a huge thing. It seemed like his influence was everywhere in RS2, and as you mentioned, Rockfall and other programs.
We just talked about RS2, but it's probably half a dozen programs that he inspired. Dips.
A lot.
Yeah, Dips, S-Wedge, on Wedge. The list goes on for okay.
So with his passing, do you think, how do you feel like you can pay it forward to the next generation to sort of keep his legacy alive? Would it be through like just your mentorship, the stuff that you learned and the way that you teach?
Oh, absolutely. Everything I do, and the way that I approach interns and employees in general is one of a teacher, much like Evert was to me. And, a lot of how I approach things and how I do things has to do with Evert and with John Curran too. It's, I couldn't have asked for two better mentors.
Yeah. No, that's very true. And I do a lot of training, in the various programs, around the world. And I must say that Everett's influence helps me make sure things are simple so that people can understand. People are smart. It's just we have to speak the right language, bring the concepts in the right way so people can get it. And he had a lot of influence in that. But aside of that is a more informal, should I say. But on the formal side, in Rocscience, one of the things we are doing to keep his legacy going is at the Rocscience International Conferences. Now we have a new award for best paper named after Dr. Evert Hook. So it's to keep his legacy going, it's to get people to understand the influence he had on rock mechanics. It's huge. So we hope to keep it going for a long time.
I think when I went into the company and I saw Hook-Brown criterion in the dialogues, I always imagined that these authors were long past. They've done their work and they're gone. And then I learned that he was still alive. He was still interacting with Rocscience. And I have sort of a funny interaction with him where he wanted me to model a tunnel in RS3 version 1.
Right.
And I think the lesson I took away from it is, well, first of all, his knowledge is unmatched. Mm-hmm. But I think the second thing was how nice he was to me for not knowing things that maybe a tunnel engineer would immediately pick up. And he was willing to sort of go back and forth with me to like talk about invert, overt, how you install liners and all so forth. And I think even just that tiny interaction, I think I'll carry that forward when I teach junior engineers.
Yeah.
That the patience it's always worth it. Like all we want is for everything to be right when we're working, and yelling and all that stuff is not going to accomplish the goal. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And saying that, Daniel, reminds me of another interesting aspect of Everett's life that, again, for me was just mind-boggling and it blew my mind. Sometimes you ask, so Reginald, what do you think? And it's a serious technical issue, and he will listen to your argument and say, okay, that's good or something. And it gives you so much confidence that, number one, Evert Hook is asking me for an opinion, and he respects it. I mean, that really, that's magic. Well,
yeah, I had many discussions with Evert over the years, and sometimes an argument or two here or there too. And it was, Evert was a good friend of mine, and he and I would always sort of laugh at the end, and to be honest, usually Evert won the argument. You talk about your particular experience with Evert, Daniel, and I can't tell you the number of similar stories I've heard from people, from other interns or employees or students or whatever. It's always the same, that he always treated people, regardless of whether they were young or old, with a great deal of respect. Now, a lot of people think of Evert as the premier rock engineer of his time. And I would say, to me, I think of him as the premier educator of his time. He really brought the industry to a whole nother level. And he was an educator.
And I think that's extremely important. I think communication, like we're doing the podcast actually, and we talk about these things, I think that's a key element that I hope that junior engineers really put effort into, because you can be very knowledgeable and then you need to explain it, whether it be a report, whether you need to on the phone, email, all of these things can impact your personal reputation and even how people take in information. Like, it might be right, but the way you said it, they're going to just wave you off because of that. So I think that's what a combination with Evert Hook, the knowledge and the communication. And I'm glad to hear about all these stories. So it just proves that he's been doing this forever, right? So
yeah.
So I think we've already talked about this. We talked about his influence and how it's guiding us throughout Rocscience's growth. I just want to ask if you have anything concluding remarks, either about Evert Hook or about the growth of Rocscience and his work, that you want to mention to our listeners before we conclude.
Well, I'll give the last word to Brent. So but what I wanted to say was that, I'm passionate about Africa, that.
Of course,
yes. I do a lot of work in Africa, but not only Africa, but still passionate about it. And I remember having a conversation a couple of years ago with Evert and saying, Evert, we started something we called African Geotechnical Legend series of lectures. And he was the first to talk. And he said he was very happy to do it because, he was originally born in Zimbabwe, studied in South Africa, things like that. But he was so enthused and he really loved it. But the whole thing was inspiring people. He did also realize that he inspired people. And he was very responsible about it because he knew it was a big responsibility. So my final thoughts are that we all carry a piece of Evert that way, that our words carry weight. We have to be careful. We have to be thoughtful and practical every time.
We've discussed so many, really positive things about Evert. And, when it comes to Rocscience and Evert Hook, they are so intertwined, and the way we do things, Evert had great input, and he taught us how to do things correctly. And he was, a remarkable engineer, right? Just absolutely remarkable. And, my wife would come to conferences. So in the early days of Rocscience, when the fewer of us, Evert, he was the rock star of rock engineering. And people would love to get their picture taken with him. And, to a point where Evert would be inundated by people. And my wife would have to sort of go with him and make sure that he would have a drink or have some lunch or stuff like that. Because he was always, being, inundated by people asking questions or wanting pictures with him and all these sort of things. That's the kind of individual he was. He was so outgoing to everybody. And, I was so lucky to come along when I did, to have met him, to have worked with him, to have been his friend. And I think, we, not only me, but a lot of the older people here that have known Evert, strive to make sure that hasn't, that's not lost with Rocscience, right? That we do the same things. We treat the interns the same way. We treat all the employees, the young employees, the same way, that there's that this is a great learning environment at Rocscience, right? I take great pride that the interns, that work here say, you know, I learned so much at your company. And, you know, that's important to us. It'll always be important to us.
And I think that's sort of led to the success of Rocscience and keeping people, like the interns going to full-time and that type of things. So I would thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for coming in so early with the flight issues. And of course, thank you for coming. Yeah,
Thank you for the espresso. I needed it.
And that's a wrap on our third episode of RS Talks. A big thank you to our guests for sharing their personal experiences about Dr. Evert Hoek, and huge thank you to you for tuning in. Be sure to follow the podcast on our favorite podcast platform, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. Until next time, can you guess what we'll dig into next?